Okay, and it's just loading now, and once this line gets to the end for me, we should be live on YouTube and be ready to start our talk here. Okay, I believe we are live. Okay, so we are, welcome everybody. I hope everybody can hear us. If you can't, go ahead and send us a message, I guess, down in the Q&A section. We'll describe that later on. My name is Kobe Rizek. I'm the president of the Buckley Program. Welcome to this Zoom conversation on art history at Yale with Professor Michael Lewis of Williams College. We look forward to discussing Yale's recent cancellation of the survey course on Western art from the Renaissance to the present, as well as the direction of the field of art history more generally. We are thankful that all of you took the time to join us this afternoon. Obviously, there is a lot going on in the world. We're all doing our best to accommodate to the changes as quickly as we can. We at the Buckley Program are doing our best to continue forwarding our mission, even though we are unable to be together on campus in person. We thank all of you in advance for your patience as we do our best to become familiar with these new technologies. In the same vein, if you do have any issues accessing our online events, please do not hesitate to reach out. Before I introduce Professor Lewis formally, I want to say a few words about the Buckley Program. For those of you who don't know, the William F. Buckley Jr. Program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows on campus have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Program forwards its mission of a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission, is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives, including those of the right, must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. The deadline to become a fellow this semester is April 1st. All Yale undergraduate and graduate students are eligible. So if you're a fellow who's online now, please share this opportunity with your peers. Please also consider applying for the Buckley Program seminar this August, titled Shakespeare's Depiction of Rome, that is taught by Professor Vicki Sullivan of Tufts University. The deadline for applying is Saturday, April 25th. All fellows who complete this seminar will also be awarded a $150 stipend. Lastly, we will be hosting another webinar quite similar to this in exactly a week. So next Wednesday, April 1st, I believe that would be, with Professor Howard Foreman of Yale to discuss the COVID-19 crisis and all of its complexity, from public health responses to economic fallout. Please be on the lookout for more details about that event. Now on to our guest, Professor Lewis. Michael Lewis is the Thyssen-Pearson Stoddard Professor of Art History at Williams College, where he teaches courses in modern architecture and American art. Professor Lewis is a regular architecture critic for the Wall Street Journal. After receiving his BA from Haverford College in 1980 and 2 years at the University of Hanover, Germany, he received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1989. He is taught at Bryn Mawr College, McGill University, Montreal, and the professor of Natal, South Africa. His books include Frank Furness' Architecture and the Violent Mind, American Art and Architecture, and the prize-winning August Reichensberger, The Politics of the German Gothic Revival. He was a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton from 2000 to 2001, and in 2008 received a Guggenheim Fellowship to support the completion of City of Refuge, his study of millennial utopias. Professor Lewis has been at Williams College since 1993, and in 2008 he was named the Thyssen-Pearson Stoddard Professor of Art, which is his current position. Does that all sound correct to you, Professor Lewis?
You've done your research, Kobe. Yes.
Well, we are all thrilled to welcome you this afternoon. I want to give a few logistic points for the attendees so that they know how to ask questions to you. We're going to hopefully start off with a few kind of general questions from myself, and then we want to move right into questions from the audience. And it looks like we have 127 people on at the moment. So the way to ask questions on the Zoom interface is if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you can see an icon that says Q&A. I hope everybody can see that. So if you're an attendee, you should be able to go in and click that and ask a question. And I'm sure there'll be a lot. I will be scrolling through and picking questions for Professor Lewis. There's not going to be any time limits on anything. We want this to flow pretty informally, like a conversation. So be sure, if you have any question that comes up through the course of the event, go ahead and put it down in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. We are also going to plan to end at 5:30 p.m. So this is normally where we have our applause to welcome you, but we can't do that over our virtual interface here. So I speak for everyone online and all the fellows when I warmly welcome you, Professor Lewis, to the Buckley Program. So thank you. At this point, I have your commentary article here. So I just wanted to ask really generally, how were you first made aware of this decision that was made? I guess it was probably made last semester and made public at the beginning of this semester. And what about that decision spurred you to want to become involved, to write about it?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Things in the world of art history are not of interest to the general public usually. What we do is seen as a kind of connoisseur's affectation, I think, for much of this country. But for some reason, this story caught fire and it got picked up by the major media, which is why my editor at Commentary, John Podhoretz, called me and asked if I wanted to weigh in on it. And I was happy to do that. But I should say, I didn't go to Yale. I have friends who teach in the department at Yale, and my article was not ad hominem toward Yale. I used the article more to talk about the things that the Yale decision represented, which is a phenomenon that affects art history as it's taught everywhere in the country. But it's a beautiful case study of what I think is the problem. So that's how it happened. And I wrote it very quickly. And I was surprised when it came out that John Podhoretz gave me the wonderfully incendiary title, How Yale's Art Department Committed Suicide, which is it's a little swankier than I would have given the title. But when you write for these magazines, you don't get to pick your title. But maybe I stand by it, because my worry is that what Yale has done, is about to do, will exclude the art department from the great mass of educated, curious people who are going into law or business or medicine, who just want to know who Michelangelo was. Right. They want to know, when they go to Europe, what is it about the Sistine Chapel? What is this Cathedral Notre Dame that they're rebuilding now? They feel a great obligation to know something about the tradition in which they stand, and they will quickly discover that the new dispensation has nothing to say to them, and they leave. So that was if you read the article, you'll notice there's a lot of sadness in it, because I see those students walking away.
Right. You have a quote at the end that, or near the end, where you say, and I'm quoting you here from your article, you said, "What has changed and what has made scholars squeamish is any sense that Western art is, quote unquote, our art. To emphasize the Western tradition is to validate it and be complicit in whatever historic crimes you might choose to impute to it, whether imperialism, colonialism, or environmental mayhem. The notion that some art is better than others, that some even rises to the pinnacle of human achievement, has become embarrassing." Before that, you talk about John Trumbull, and you talk about his place in the history of Yale and his donation of his personal collection near the end of his life to Yale. what change do you perceive as an art historian happened between that time and where we are now, where, as you say, you know, the notion that any art rises to the pinnacle of human achievement is really an embarrassment to say, not something that is really appropriate to say anymore. What changes took place, and how do you perceive sort of your own experience and your own position within those changes?
Well, you're asking for a summary of 200 years of
Right.
American culture. The event you're talking about, the critical one, is the loss of cultural confidence, which is a post-World War II phenomenon that really began to gallop and accelerate in the late 1960s. And then it reached thunderingly into academia in the 1990s. And that is when you start to find with retirements that department after department no longer taught Shakespearean drama, art of the Italian Renaissance, or 19th century French art. And so it's a lack of cultural confidence. You know, there is a fabulous article by Heather McDonald, who went to Yale. I think she's class of 1978. Heather McDonald in Quillette,
Right.
Journal, about the Yale case. And she brought up an extraordinary point where she talks about the double standard, which is that in art history now, the Western canon is looked at with the deepest suspicion and hostility. This is what the writer Paul Ricoeur calls the hermeneutics of suspicion. If you know that phrase, the hermeneutics of suspicion is that when you are presented with a bundle of ideas or assertions, rather than accepting first at face value the explanation that comes with them, you immediately suspiciously begin to look for the hidden agenda or the subversive content that you're being manipulated or somehow potentially being oppressed. That's the hermeneutics of suspicion. That the first thing you bring to a cultural package is suspicion. And Heather McDonald pointed out that is only applied to the West. Cultural suspicion is never brought to the study of Chinese art or Islamic art or African art. It's something peculiarly that's turned on us alone. And that why that has happened is a subject for a different and longer debate. But it is certainly a double standard.
So at this point, I wanted to, and we're not going to go quite there yet. Well, I guess we do have a question now. So if you're okay with it, I was going to move into questions from the audience.
Sure.
So we have one from an audience member here that says, what would you say, Professor Lewis, to the students who are studying economics, maybe a field in STEM, etc., who see leaving the study of art history with the absence of a survey course? Is there a way students can still experience and learn about Michelangelo and the classics with these changes? What do you recommend?
Well, you know, that's a nice question. Is that from an economics major? It doesn't say.
It doesn't say, so I'm not sure.
Well, you know, the fact is I was an economics major. I took no art history. I thought it had nothing to say to me. I was ignorant. I was 18. And in my final year, I wandered into a course on urban history under false pretenses. It turned out to be art history, but I was captivated. And if it hadn't happened then, if it hadn't caught me then, my life would have taken a different trajectory. So in my own teaching, those are the people I want to reach. People like me, for whom art history is not going to be their career path, but they're curious about it. If you don't get it in the classroom, you can get it through good reading. Read Kenneth Clark. There are great writers out there. But boy, art is something that is best done not in solitude. Go to museums, go with your friends and talk about things. Go regularly to your local museum with a friend and adopt a work of art. I mean, get one that you feel is yours and look at it every month and it will change. As you change, it will change. So you can do a lot through selected reading and looking, but you can leap ahead if you've got a good teacher. I mean, go with a friend who knows art. You don't need us. You don't need us
Right.
to learn about art.
What has your experience been as a professor at Williams? How do you approach teaching these topics? And do you discuss with your students sort of these different movements that are happening within the field? What do they think of it?
Well, we talk about it. My teaching lecture courses on the history of modern architecture and American art. Seminars. I do a seminar on architectural criticism. I'm doing one now on architectural theory. Yeah, these things come up. I've been teaching at Williams since '93, and it's funny, when I began teaching and I was closer in age to my students, I was pretty much on the same psychological wavelength with them. And I could almost anticipate what their thoughts would be or reactions. And decade by decade, as your life goes on, that changes. And the first time it hit me how much the cultural change has occurred. I think of it sort of like an iceberg suddenly dropping from Greenland.
Right.
You're not aware of the slow movement of the glacier until there's the break. And I got the break a few years ago when I was showing one of the great paintings of World War II, Freedom of Speech by Norman Rockwell, which shows a New England town meeting where a sturdy workman in a work jacket is standing up to speak at a town meeting, and everyone around him is in a white is in a suit with a black tie, and they're all looking at him, and it's beautiful. Norman Rockwell was great at guiding the eye to what you should look at, and you should look at this man who's not a polished speaker. He's looking ahead. He looks a little like a young Lincoln. He's looking overhead, as fighting to say what he wants to say. And it's a gorgeous example of graphic art, the manipulation of sight lines and props, because you can tell by the clothing that he doesn't belong in this privileged world. Anyway, I asked my students to analyze it, and right away two students of my best students said, well, this is clearly a white supremacist meeting. And I said, what? They said, well, it's only white people there. And I didn't quite realize that it is rare for them in today's cultural climate to ever see a picture of a group of people that's all Caucasian. And that maybe it comes from a generation that doesn't watch movies older than 7 or 10 years. But so sometimes things come up that surprise me, because I think I know what they're reading and what my students are exposed to. But what always catches me off guard is when I find out a large chunk of things that they're not exposed to. That's the surprising thing.
This is sort of an interesting question here from one of our audience members. Do you see a resurgence of the Western canon in the study of art history?
Oh, I see a great longing for it. I think at Yale, I think the phenomenon was this year when it was turned out that this was the swan song for the course. It was mobbed. Am I right about that? Great numbers. Right. Oh, I think there is a deep longing. But see, academia moves as slowly as a battleship.
Mm-hmm.
A generation of scholars that is in place now is going to be there for a generation or two. And they were brought up in a different world. I think they're going to find out that their students have much more sympathy and respect for the Western canon than they do. But it's going to take a long time for that to manifest itself. And I have a feeling right now in today's job market, showing a sympathy for Western art on its own terms might be a career killer. I think it might be.
Right. That kind of connects to this. You mentioned how slow things can move in academia, and we have another question here that's is asking you, what do you think is really going on at Yale? Why did Yale do this? And this person thinks that this decision seems to have come sort of from the top rather than because of any specific organized protest or call for this change from the students.
You're at Yale. I'm not. I don't know. This is a nice conspiracy theory. It came from the top. Well, the department chairman is Tim Barringer, who's a first-rate historian. One of the first reviews I wrote was praising his show on the American Hudson River School landscape painting almost 20 years ago. From the top, in the sense that it reflects the common understanding of my profession now. Yeah, it's probably faculty driven rather than a groundswell of student support. In my experience, students are very interested in the names they've heard about. They're interested in Bernini and Borromini and Cézanne and Van Gogh and Gaudí. Who's this crazy Catalan architect? There's a great interest in them.
And someone wants to know now, when you mentioned the anecdote about the student's comment about the Norman Rockwell painting, what did you as a professor say to that student's comment? How did you respond?
Oh, you have to learn from your student's question, especially if you don't like it, because it's always true. It represents something they saw. And at that moment, I had to recalibrate what I thought I knew about their frame of awareness. Well, I patiently explained to them that they had to remember this is Norman Rockwell, who lived not far from Williamstown in Vermont, which was homogeneously white, more than 99% in 1944. I think the painting was 43 or 44. It was not a white supremacist meeting, but it was an understandable mistake. Yeah. What you can't do in class is the teacher in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where you say else. No.
Right. We have, boy, they are really coming in here. And Professor, you can see them too. So I'm trying to scroll through these and pick out the ones
I can't.
Oh, you can't.
I'll let you accept them.
Okay. I have one here that asks, just had it here. Oh, right. It's about someone, you mentioned Notre Dame. What do you think will happen with the reconstruction, and what all do you know about the reconstruction process?
Well, it's moved up against the Rock of Gibraltar of French bureaucracy. I don't know. It should be done as slowly as possible and as carefully as possible. The danger is that Macron wants it finished by 2024 for the Olympics. You can't rush something like that. I think it can be done. It can be done accurately. The carving can be done. The timber can be grown, and that is precisely what should be done. The last thing you want is any ego statement by any architect on top of that. I don't think the world now will allow it. In a way, as sad as that day was, it was very heartening to realize how much love for that building permeates the world. No, they're not going to screw that one up. The danger now is it's a substantial part of it still could fall in because of the softening of the stone by the fire. It's limestone, which can lose its structural integrity invisibly inside. That's the danger.
So it's still an unknown to that end.
Still an unknown. Fortunately, it was measured scrupulously by computer scanning very shortly before the fire, so they are able to replicate it.
So I'm going to move on to another question here. This is from another attendee. It says, is all art equal then? How do we value art inside and outside of aesthetics or culture? Is there a level of criticism or skepticism, as you talked about earlier, that you would recommend when we experience art?
Is all art equal? It doesn't say what is that a student at Yale? Doesn't say.
I'm not sure. For me, it just says attendee.
Yeah, okay. Well, is all art equal? I am guessing that person hasn't had a drawing one class, because you go into drawing one and you all draw the same vase for 3 weeks, and you know exactly where you stand in that tier. it's merciless. And you get better. You get better each week doing it. Interestingly, our athletes make the most progress, surprisingly, because they're used to taking direction from coaches. 5 hours of charcoal? Okay, coach. They're used to applying themselves and not questioning. No, art is not equal. And if you do it, if you do the same thing in a class, you quickly realize that. What I try to talk to my students about when this comes up, if they haven't had a couple drawing classes and could see the level of skill, I say, well, that's okay. You don't have to assume that everything you're going to hear in here is the subjective opinion of Lewis. We're going to look at important works of art. And then the student says, well, what's an important work of art? How can you tell? Well, the criterion is always the same: the ability to generate copies. The things that are influential have an influence by replicating themselves, almost like this damn virus that's running rampant.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be apologetic and say, well, it's just your subjective opinion. If you audition for to play violin in the Philadelphia Orchestra, I'm in Philadelphia right now. It's not a matter of opinion who's the better violinist. Your audition behind a curtain, they know.
But we should still look, I think the second part of the question is, we should still look at the best art, the art that's been replicated most, that is most influential, with a degree of skepticism. Well, and I don't know, I'm not quite sure what the attendee means by skepticism, but what does it look like to both acknowledge when something is influential and important relatively, and also learn to be critical of it in a certain sense?
Well, I think you have to be critical. If you have your opinions and judgments, but we should try to make in this what Lincoln called our passing speck of time. We just have a little bit of 12 weeks with the students. We should make their criticism more informed. So the burden of the course should be principally to let you see the art for a long time and get to understand what it is about it that's significant, how it relates to other works of art, and how it operates.
Right.
And you do that first. I mean, you could do it as a philosophy seminar and have 95% opinion and just 5% fact. But I think for this preliminary course, you want to know the facts. You want to get them straight. And then before you start making judgments about them.
So we have a question here that's a little longer, if you're okay with that. It says, I appreciate your art, Professor Lewis, I appreciate your article very much. I think you are particularly accurate in your diagnosis that art history is morphing into anthropology, and art historians in academia are not confident enough to make bold, evaluative statements, especially about Western work. But you do too much credit to the survey course. I took Professor Behringer's survey course and was disappointed to see how he twisted the subject matter to fit an ideological argument, focusing first and foremost on the quote unquote downtrodden voices in art history.
Well, what can I say about that? You, in the classroom, you are king. You can do, I'm sorry to hear that, but he's a first-rate scholar. He's a good writer. I could see why he would believe that would be the right thing to do. I haven't sat in on his classes, but I do feel the danger of that is that students who are well-informed, who've been shopping around classes at Yale, have heard that story in other classes about the exclusion of the downtrodden, if I can coarsely and vulgarly summarize that line of thought. And once they hear it in his class, they'll recognize they've heard that before, but they haven't heard before about David, which is why they're there. And the more they hear the political story that they've heard before, the more they yawn and quietly tiptoe out the door.
We have many questions here.
Well, that's funny because our numbers are dropping, Kobe. I see we started with a high of 141. You just sent
And we have 36 open questions that we haven't addressed yet. So here's one here. Do you think this type of revisionist philosophy in art is analogous to other fields, perhaps? A rejection of the accepted canon in medicine is gaining popularity in some progressive circles, for example, the anti-vax movement, or a move towards implementing Oriental medicine into Western practices, or for example, claiming that J. Marion Sims should not be revered because of some of his earliest procedures on slaves. So that was one of the questions that just came in.
Well, I know nothing about medical revisionism, and if I were to say anything about it, it would be foolish of me. But I understand that the tendency, it's again, it's what I referred to as the hermeneutics of suspicion. And you call it revisionist, but it's interesting. Nothing is being revised now. That in a sense, that has become mainstream thought at the prestigious universities, that there is some fundamental primal original sin of Western culture for which we must do penance and must make our students aware of. We should not see ourselves in the position of upholding, glorifying, celebrating in any way the Western tradition. That's not revisionist anymore to say that. It might have been in 1968. It would be revisionist now to come along and say, wait a minute, the Western tradition is the finest humanist tradition that world culture has ever created. Let's look at it sympathetically and respectfully. That would be revisionist.
If regimes of power, and this is moving into another area, these regimes of power are responsible for legitimizing art, institutions like museums or art history courses, how are we able to separate traditional critiques or evaluations of art from the power that they hold in society?
That's a big question. Right now, at the moment, the institutions of power are part of that, what I said, the new mainstream, which does not glorify the West. So I think I couldn't quite tell where that question is coming from. Is it someone referring to the old systems of power?
It seems to me.
Patriotic mainstream. Well, that's effectively defunct and powerless now. So the challenging question now would be to think skeptically about our new systems of power, like the one at Yale, which is abolishing the course we're talking about.
I'm curious if you're familiar with the directed studies program at Yale.
No.
Okay, well, it is a introduction really to the Western canon through history and literature and philosophy and political thought that is available for all freshmen or first years, as we now have to say, to take. And the question was from one of our, from an alumnus who asked if this trend could undermine programs like directed studies. I wasn't sure if you're familiar with that program.
No, this isn't the Bass gift, the big gift that Yale got to teach Western civilization, but that was a generation ago. This is not that.
I don't know what year. I didn't do directed studies. Someone may be able to answer what year it started, but I believe it started in the 50s, and it's been ongoing since then.
The question I would have is who teaches it, because it always comes down to personnel. Is the actual professor sympathetic, or because they can't be controlled? There was a time when university presidents could control the content of classroom teaching, no longer. So I think a program like that would be fabulous, and I'd like to see it, but done on a voluntary basis by people who believe in it, who are not looking at it as an exercise of debunking.
Right. Moving beyond just Yale, do you have any guidance on what you think some of the best history of art programs are in the United States currently? And maybe you believe that it still is at Yale.
Well, yeah, Yale, you may well be the best because of reasons I I spoke about in the article, you're the first, because of the peculiar gift of Trumbull, that you got an art museum when there were no art museums in America to speak of. It's the first purpose-built building, as I say in the article, exclusively for the display of art. And from the beginning, Yale could teach through objects, and that's the only way to do it. And you built a program, and they all do it. The Yale faculty is first rate. My quarrel isn't with the quality of their teaching. My quarrel is with the exclusive focus on generating bright graduate students rather than addressing the broader student body. Yale's probably the best. This is from a career point of view. If you're looking to go to graduate school in any field, there's always two questions. Do you have a first-rate advisor, and do you have depth in the department? And you should have both, because your first-rate advisor might drop dead that summer. It's happened. I've seen it happen. So you want to have broad coverage. So Yale has it both ways. You've got terrific teachers and terrific resource. Well, three ways, and a long tradition of teaching with those objects.
So this is sort of a.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, Princeton's good. Princeton, Yale are better than Harvard. Harvard's good.
You mentioned what happened at Princeton in your commentary article.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about that?
Simply to say that Princeton and Harvard also jettisoned their standard issue survey course, but that was a generation ago. Nobody noticed, and it fascinates me that this story exploded right now, and it may be because you Yaleys are successful and you're everywhere and you knew about it. It may be because of so many influential people who took the survey course under Vincent Scully, legendary Vincent Scully, whose lectures were like aerobics exercise. He would caper around and show with his body the forces of each painting and sculpture fantastically. And actually, the controversy shows that the reason the Yale program was so good is that people who are not art historians went through it in a life-changing way and took notice. And that didn't happen when Princeton and Harvard threw theirs overboard.
So it turns out, Professor, that some people would like to ask their question directly to you. I didn't realize I had the capability to do this until now, but it looks like we have one person who would like to ask directly. That's John Hazelwood. So if he's on, I'm going to turn on his microphone and he can ask his question. So John, you should be able to talk at this point. We should be able to hear you. Make sure you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. He may not be on anymore.
Well, I'm on.
Oh, perfect.
I didn't ask to ask a question. I have no question. You.
Oh, it had your hand raised here.
No, I don't.
Oh, well, for some reason it's showing me in Zoom. Sorry about that, John. Thank you for coming.
I'm enjoying the lecture, by the way.
Great, thank you. We have another person here.
You saw the hands clapping. There's a gesture they can make of hands clapping.
And now I'm seeing them raising as I went there. I think everybody's realizing that they can do that now. So we have Alex Hugh with his hand raised. Alex, we should be able to hear you. Well, I don't think we actually can. Michael Skoll, I think we can hear you.
Yes, this is Michael Skoll. I just want to, it's not so much a question as is a confirmation of what the professor has said. I took Vincent Scully's course in 1961, and since Yale, I didn't go into art history. I went to museums. I became a Foreign Service officer, did all sorts of other things. But nothing was so revealing, so exciting as watching the aerobics of Vincent Scully. And I have talked about him and talked about the way he explained art. And of course, the course I took was all American architecture. And I could not agree more with the notion that even those of us who don't spend the rest of our lives in art history benefit from this kind of thing. And in fact, for me, the American part of it was signally important because it made me prouder of my country. It made me a better representative of my country. Anyway, it's not a question unless I can ask if the professor does not agree.
The professor does agree. And Michael Skoll is exactly the kind of person I was talking about who will not take this reimagined course. And it's a tragic loss. I envy your experience.
Thank you, Michael. It looks like we have a question from Avi Nelson. So I'm going to unmute that individual and we should be able to hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
The name is Avi Nelson, and I was a classmate of Michael Skoll and still a friend. The question I have is, Professor, there have got to be colleagues of yours, other members of the faculty at sophisticated universities who share your concern about what's happening. Are they intimidated into silence? Do they speak up? Has there been any attempt to form an organization or a group to combat or at least offer a different perspective from what seems to be, unfortunately, sweeping campus after campus?
Avi, that's a good question. Unfortunately, there is great dissatisfaction of the kind you just described, but it has not reached a critical mass to the extent that it has any organizational existence. And the problem is, although I know a great many colleagues who are sympathetic to my viewpoint. I have tenure. I can shoot my mouth off. It's okay. But if someone doesn't, it could be perilous. And there are departments that once they become ideologically left, they become homogenous. And all hires from then are among the ranks of true believers. And those departments are beyond redemption. I'm afraid it would take some deep cover agents, some Soviet moles to infiltrate. And nowadays in our politicized world, people are aware of your politics. When I was hired in 1993 at Williams, they didn't know my politics and they weren't particularly curious about them. Nowadays, somebody like me would not be hired, I'm afraid. So the answer is no. There is not yet the corporate body to represent, to bring together in a unified way the forces you're talking about. But the people are out there and they're disgruntled, but it hasn't reached the critical mass yet.
Could tenured faculty members like you, who don't have to fear when they speak up, could they be the nucleus of forming some kind of, I hate to use the word opposition, but that's what it comes down to, some kind of opposition perspective?
Well, I like the idea and it's very inspiring. But it would be necessarily decentralized because you're only going to have one person in each department who becomes a pariah the moment he joins your group. But okay, so I think we're a long way yet from this changing the field. The field right now has almost become monolithic. Yale is not an exception. Yale is a beautiful example of what's happened across the country and across the field. And it's virtually monolithic.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson, for your question.
Thank you.
Looks like we have another. Can you still hear me, Professor Lewis?
Yes.
Okay, I have a little glitch there. It looked like we have one from Daniel Lowenstein, it looks like. So Daniel or Danielle, I'm not sure if you can hear us.
Yes.
Mr. Lowenstein, can you hear us?
Yes, my name is Daniel Lowenstein, and
Can
my
hear
name
you.
may be familiar to Professor Lewis because I've been pestering him for the last couple of years.
I know you.
Come and lecture at UCLA for a center I direct there. I also am another person who took Professor Scully's survey course. It was in directed studies. It was in 1960-61. And what I got out of that course is a little different from what others have said. I'm not really visually gifted. I'm not good at looking at works of art, but I do read a lot of literature and a lot of history. And what I found that I got from that course was when I'm reading about a period or reading something written from a period and a place, I have some idea of how those people saw the world visually. And I have found that throughout my life to be very valuable. The question I wanted to ask you, though, is different. I was one of the first group of students who moved into Ezra Stiles College when it opened. I loved my room there. I loved living in the college. I thought the building was fairly ugly. And when I revisited it at my 25th reunion, I thought it had not aged well. But I've seen photographs of the two new colleges at Yale, and from the photographs at least, they look quite lovely, traditional, not imitative as far as I can tell. And I wondered if you've had a chance to look at those new colleges, and if so, what you think of them.
I know them only from photographs. I haven't been back to Yale in some years, and after this talk, I guess I'm not going to be invited. But they're by Robert.
We'll invite you back, Professor Lewis.
Except they're by Robert A.M. Stern, who is terrific. He was, I think, Dan, I think you know this. He was the dean of Yale School of Architecture. He's very sympathetic to the historic styles, and he's particularly sensible to place. He knows Yale very well, and he knows the tradition of your fabulous neo-Gothic dormitories, Sterling Library, and he worked in that as a living vernacular. From what I've seen of the photographs, they look beautifully scaled. The material, the palette of material is warm and rich. Do the students like them? I don't know. I mean, maybe Kobe has to tell us that.
Well, I am a student of, much like Dan, I am a student of Ezra Stiles now. I live there. So I will say it's grown on me over the past few years. But as far as the new colleges, I've certainly heard mixed opinions. I know some people really like them a lot. And I've heard other reviews that say maybe they don't have the character that others do necessarily, and maybe feel more artificial. But I would, on that same vein, I'd like to see some more student hands up. So if you're a student, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll do my best to get to you. And I want
ages just because we had 3 students of the late.
We have a question from Asst. And Dan, if you were finished, I was going to move on to the next question. We really appreciate it.
Do I need to undo this? Okay.
I can do it for you. I think we have Esteban on. Can you hear us? Well, actually, it says that for some reason I can't use Esteban's question because he doesn't have the right version of Zoom, unfortunately. So we'll move on to Thomas.
Hello. Hi there. I wanted to ask you, I'd heard a lot of people talking about where people might be able to access resources about architecture or art history specifically in the Western context. And I recently discovered the Institute for Classical Architecture, Art and Architecture. It's based in New York City, and I found that it had a lot of supplemental educational material that really goes into very detailed explanations of different styles and how they came to be, and a lot of stuff like that. So I thought I'd throw that out there.
Tom or Thomas, I'm glad you mentioned that. The ICAA, Institute for Classical Art and Architecture, has a brilliant 4-part video series on classical architecture.
Yes.
Yeah, you've seen it.
What's
It's on YouTube for free.
Yeah.
And it's very good. And
How they're lost, no?
yeah. And actually, since
Yeah.
we're all under virtual house arrest these days,
Yes.
you can spend a nice 4 hours learning about classical architecture and open a bottle of wine.
Mhm.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks. Great picture there.
Yeah.
We have another question that came in, I think, from Neal. So Neal, if you're on, I'm going to allow you to talk.
Yes, thank you very much. First, Professor Lewis, thank you very much for adding some wonderful intellectual value to what is a very difficult time that we're going through. My second question is, if you had one day in New York City to see art, how would you spend that day?
One day, well, for architecture, you should walk the whole length of 42nd Street at Bryant Park, the New York Public Library. You should look up at the Chrysler Building. You should see Raymond Hood's Radiator Building. And you should then you'd have to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. If you have one day, pick one, and the Met is encyclopedic. You pretty much want to be at the Met and choose a wing, or maybe 2 wings, maybe the American wing and then Greek or medieval. Don't overburden yourself. Take your time, have a long meal in the middle. I think that would be the most satisfying one. The MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, has been rebuilt, but it's not a good experience for one day. It's a little too crowded and jangly. The Met is your best bet. It's a generously scaled building. It breathes, and that would be my advice. But make sure you get outside. 42nd Street is a great walk. Alternatively, go to the lower tip of Manhattan. Go to the Memorial for the World Trade Center, and you'll experience a couple different types of the American city. You get the lower Manhattan, the 1840s pre-Civil War city. A few blocks away, you get where we are today. That'd be my tip.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Neal. We appreciate it. We have another student question, Professor, and this is from one of our students, Rosie, who has her hand up. So, Rosie, we should be able to hear you.
Hi. So my question is, Buckley talks are one of the things that I love most about Yale. And sorry, I'm reading this question from my friend Asst, who does not have correct version of Zoom. I'm just going to read verbatim what he wrote. He just says, Buckley talks are one of the things I miss most about Yale since I graduated in December. So thank you, Lauren and Kobe, for making this happen, given the circumstances. You talk about penance. The point of penance is to confess your sins and receive absolution. The priest gives you a list of tasks, usually prayer, to complete the confession. I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel, do you? In regards to the left, like revising classes in that aspect.
Wow. I like the Lenten focus that we have to repent. I agree we have to repent. I don't know how to get a program out of that. If that's what Esteban is asking for. But let me say this. Let me use this opportunity to pick up on it. That question reminds us that art is a spiritual thing. At the highest level, it's not a squiggle or a bit of of fanciful calligraphy. It is something about our human capacity, and our human capacity is limited. There are things we want to do, we can't. Everywhere in our life, we face limits. How many years we have, what talents we have, what we look like. We're limited. So art is the triumph of our ideals and our aspirations over our limitations, and that's a beautiful thing. The person who's trying at the absolute level, what they can, working at that, straining to hit the highest note. And you should come out of a history of art course inspired by that straining, yearning, trying at the highest levels. You should not come out thinking, all right, I found some more examples of oppression. But I knew that before, that the world is a cruel and unfair place. You should know that. And to me, the tragedy of what I think is about to happen with the splintering of this course into various identity courses, what's going to happen is we lose, and I'm speaking to Rosie and Esteban, and not exactly your question, but it inspires this thought. What we lose is the ability of art to talk to other courses. And when we teach the Italian Renaissance, we show Michelangelo's David. There's this beautiful, noble nude, standing upright, proud, massive hands. And there's a belief when you see that in the intrinsic dignity and beauty of the human form. That's Renaissance humanism. And it takes a while to see how beautiful it is, because you've got to see a lot of bad statues to realize why that's a great statue. Then when you realize why Michelangelo's so good, then you can move on to Hamlet, where Shakespeare says, what a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, all that great speech. That's our highest statement of humanism in literature. And you go to Thomas Jefferson, Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator. Right? So if you've got these touchstones, you realize there is a big humanist contribution that Western culture made that manifests itself in painting and music and drama and it ultimately in politics. So by making art history a narrowly focused bit of guild knowledge that prepares you to art history, it no longer speaks to our culture at large. And if that's the case, if you've done that, you should confess your sins.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosie and Esteban.
Thanks.
Yeah, Rosie. We have a few more. Since we started a few minutes late, I want to make time for maybe one more question. We have one, it seems, from Alexandra here. So Alexandra, if you can hear us. Go ahead.
I just wanted to know, if you had to pick just three, what would you say were the three most influential works of art in the Western canon, given the context of what you just said in your previous answer?
I had to pick three. I feel like I'm on a game show here. Well, Chartres Cathedral, right there, it codifies what a Gothic building can do, dematerializing the wall. I would take that. I would take Velázquez's Las Meninas. I don't know if you know this great, large, vertical format painting. It's a self-portrait of Velázquez painting the royal court. It's a group painting, and it is at the highest intellectual level about seeing, the limitations of seeing. It's musical in the organization of figures. I'd take those two. The third.
Chartres Cathedral, Velázquez.
I'd have to pick some 20. So what have we got? We've got a building, we've got a painting. I'd have to pick a sculpture. Maybe I would pick, but I've already got Michelangelo. I want him twice.
Bernini?
Into a corner, I didn't think ahead. I'd pick Rodin's Melancholy Thinker. I'd pick Rodin's Melancholy Thinker because that represents what the West does well. it broods over itself. It asks questions about itself. And that's a lovely encapsulation of our self-doubt, which I think is one of the great strengths of the West. The West is the one culture that historically, since the ancient Greeks, has been curious about the whole world and takes its insights and compares it against itself. So I picked The Thinker. Not the best work of sculpture, but a great work to talk about.
Alexandra,
Thank you very much.
Professor, I know I said that was the last one, but I promise this is really the last one. And I wanted to end today's discussion with a student question that is sort of disagreeing with you in the spirit of
for a contrary
disagreement. So it's a little long. It'll take me a few seconds to read it, but here it is. It says, basically, the new survey courses aim to be more comparative in nature. Politics of representation is meant to be a one-course introduction to art history that looks at the representation of the human form in art from Greece to Russian formalism. But every week there are comparisons to other heights of world art. For example, week 2 compares the Acropolis to Persepolis. Week 3 compares Roman portraits. The idea here is to develop more general skills of visual analysis rather than to memorize the 1,000 artworks of gardeners or some other textbook by the end of the semester. Do you have thoughts on this? There isn't a hatred of the West or aesthetic relativism. An addendum to the question is, he's not even sure what it might mean to be confident about Western art as good art in comparison, example to Versailles versus the Forbidden City. Do we really need to make a value judgment here?
Well, that's a reasonable question. But Versailles, the Forbidden City, I teach a lot of international students at Williams, and some from China who would know the Forbidden City. And I think it's my primary obligation to teach them Western art because they came to the West to study. When I went to Germany in 1980, I didn't expect my German professors to teach me about American art and architecture. I expected to learn about German art. That's why I went there. So I think you do have a prime obligation to teach the people who've come to study with you where they are in the world. Now, the other part of your question is am I able, Kobe, to use a share screen and show a picture?
Yes, absolutely.
What's the name of this student? Is this Alexandra? No, not Alexandra. We've done with Alexandra. It's
this is Alex.
Alex. Okay, I'm going to hit share screen and show a picture. Now, do you all see that picture of Degas?
Can someone comment in the questions if they can see it? Yes, really quickly.
2 ballet dancers at the bar?
Yes, they can see it.
You can all see it?
Yes.
Okay. All right, this is a painting we show every other year or so to beginning students. And we ask, and it's very interesting, just mostly spatial silence. 2 young ballerinas stretching at the bar before they practice, mostly floor, and in the lower left, a water can. So when we teach this, we ask the students in our small discussion group, why the water can? Why the water can? And there's always a long silence. The first class, people don't know each other. And finally, some poor kid who was forced by his mom to take dance lessons, doesn't want to reveal it, finally says, well, you have to water the floor. And I guess the reason you water the floor is to create a certain amount of friction, not too much, not too little, just to get a little traction so you don't go gliding. And whenever that happens, the class is immensely satisfied. That's why the water can is there. So we tell them, well, that's necessary but not sufficient. There's another reason the water can is there. And it takes a long time before you get out of them. But if you look at the water can, you've got the cylindrical shape with this arm stretched up, and you realize that's the exact same shape that the ballerina in the upper right is making. So the lower left and the upper right of the painting talk to each other, creates this beautiful repetition. And it takes a long time to get it out of the students because it typically Americans see function, we don't see shape. And it takes a whole semester just looking at shapes and the beauty of shapes, the contours, the roundness, to look at all the possible forms a cylinder can take before you can really appreciate it. And the danger in an approach that doesn't do it is that the person ends up thinking they know about art, but all they're doing is becoming very glib at assigning these pre-digested opinions to works of art. So there's a little example of the kind of eye training you have to do that really takes a whole semester to, and in fact, it takes a lifetime. And that's one of the great things about art is you keep learning all your life, I hope.
Thank you so much, Professor Lewis. I know I speak for, we have over 90 people, 93 on now.
We drove
all of us,
them away.
This was a terrific conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. I know the questions sometimes were a little diffuse all over the place, but as they were coming in, I did my best to try to steer us in an interesting direction. So thank you again for joining us.
All the best. Stay healthy.
Yes, you too.
Bye-bye.